advertising, how do I describe it, festival, because it's a lot more about participating in kind of a local flavor than it is sometimes in advertising. But I was participating in the conclave with a number of people that were there from around the world, and the topic really was about how do we brand India. And Sir John Hegarty, who is the H in BBH, kind of brought up a topic that I hadn't really thought about before. And he had mentioned during his presentation, or part of the discussion, he mentioned this notion of belonging. And he actually went through a really interesting case study showing some of the work that BBH had done specifically over the past that really kind of demonstrated the notion that brands are really there to belong, or to at least provide a sense of belonging. And he went back into the annals of advertising history and kind of brought it up to the modern day. But I think what was disappointing for me was the fact that he kind of left it at television. And he kind of hinted around or danced around a bit this notion of belonging in the digital space. So it's been a couple of days for me to kind of acclimate back into the real world and out of that kind of party beach scene. But I've been thinking about how brands belong within the digital space. And I had a presentation that I had completely done before Goa because I knew what Goa was going to do to me. But in the past couple of days, I've rewritten this presentation to focus particularly on this point. And it's a little bit of a stream of thought, but I hope you bear with me. I think it really is about how can we engage consumers in a much more meaningful way, much differently than what's been done in the past. So Lady Gaga, the uprising, the turmoil that took place in Egypt, and Ducati. I think three very, very disparate kind of themes. But I think the question really is what do they have in common? And I think from my perspective, and this has nothing to do with me being the president of Tribal DDB, I think that's the notion of Tribal DDB, is to communicate in ways that are meaningful to people. But no pun intended here, it really is about tribes. And the fact that each of these entities has very successfully, and in its own terms, kind of garnered this relationship with consumers, that people actually want to belong to either what that brand means or what that effort or event means to them, or how it actually defines them. In fact, social anthropologist Bob Deutsch has actually termed this phenomenon as social tribes. How have tribes evolved over time? I think it's pretty simple. I think initially tribes were there for survival. It was easier to fight and to stay alive if you had someone watching your back than it was to be on your own. And I think individually people saw the merit in gathering together for self-preservation, self-protection. I think it moved very quickly to beyond that to be more about cooperation, collaboration, and making connections. So we see this development of societies, and the fact that people want to move from this phase of self-preservation into more of a collaborative mode in order to belong. And I think people want to belong to something that's meaningful to them, which is the third phase, which is more about ethos, which is kind of where I think we are right now, where we're beginning to see that the world is flat again. And that's using a term from a famous columnist in the United States and Pulitzer Prize winner. He's basically said that the world once again is flat, and that we are now beginning to see ourselves as belonging to communities and associations that are meaningful to us, and not necessarily what's being told is important. We're making that self-definition of what the world is all about. Advertising has changed as well. The Neanderthal days, back in the turn of the century, I use this imagery because I'm a big fan of this particular artist. Leonardo Cappiello was a French artist, which actually he was an ad man kind of extraordinaire, but he created this genre of actually taking products and putting them on a pedestal and wanting to create this energy around a particular brand or product. And that pedestal actually drove people's motivations to consume and to want that. I think we see that as that beginning of advertising where we see things around us and we kind of covet those things. But the bottom line is that these brands were talking at people. And more importantly, they were held on a pedestal that oftentimes people couldn't reach, but they aspired to those brands. And I think we've used those words over and over again over the past millennium in advertising, is to build aspiration and demand. And I think that's rapidly changing. We went into a period of creative revolution, being part of DDB. I think Volkswagen is a very sexy case study of how we began to turn the tables in consumer marketing, and we really began to relate to people, and not just talking at them, but actually taking values that people have about particular brands, making fun of that, creating humorous situations, but we began to really kind of involve people and people's emotions in advertising. That second creative revolution, which we are pretty much at the tail end of right now, is really about taking external brand image and creating more of a social commentary. And I think brands like initially Apple and Nike have killed this. They've done an amazing job in being social commentators and being relevant, but they've been relevant on the big screen, or they've been relative on the playing field, and they haven't necessarily been relative in our lives as much as they could have been. We really see that before the internet, we had this really kind of divisive approach to brands and to communications, whereas a brand held very close to its core values and what that brand, they molded it, they shaped it, then they passed it on to others and expected them to kind of take it and then kind of define it for themselves, but there really wasn't any engagement. I think today you see that wall has really been it has been broken down, and I think that even though brands are still talking about and developing their own brand communications and their own cultures, I think people are now involved in that process as well. Not just, again, with the companies themselves, but external components are very, very integral to how brands see themselves and how they actually see themselves internally. And that helps them develop creative strategies that we were talking about a moment ago that become far more effective in the social media space. Just as an example, I think yesterday it was about MJ, Michael Jordan. It's about, in the face of marketers, it's about us telling you how good a brand really is and how important it is in your life. Whereas today it really is, the swoosh means a little something more. I think because of social media and because of the way that we see the brands and talk about the brands and share things that are important to us, we see Nike in a completely different way. And I think now, within the halls of Nike, I worked on the Nike brand for 7 years and still have close ties with many people that are there leading it on a global level. They see the fact that they are held up as an example, and that they need, and the pressure's on them, and they need to really be a shining example of how business is done in an environmental conscious and a socially conscious manner. So I think on the one example, we see the boisterousness and the confidence of a very successful Nike brand. On the other side of that coin, we also see what that does and what that allows in the social media space, is that you're now held up as an example. And brands need to be very, very aware of what that means to them. In fact, they really need to define their brand in a true and meaningful way for consumers. And these are things that they're thinking about internally, but at the same time, that has a reflection on the outward appearance of a brand. Harley-Davidson is definitely not for everyone, but that's something that's in their own brand guidelines. That they're true to that. Harley-Davidson has recently come to India, and we're in the process of kind of helping them get off the ground in terms of what their brand ethos means in India, but they're still tenaciously holding on to the fact that Harley is not for everyone, and it won't be for everyone in India due to tariffs and the pricing. It's unapproachable to a certain degree, but even then it's a mindset. Very rarely do you see a Harley-Davidson t-shirt worn in India or a belt buckle or boots it's working its way into the economy and into the mindset of people. It's a brand culture that people are a little bit unaware of in a place like India. But at the same time, the brand is maniacal about, as is Nike and other brands, they're maniacal about the way they're perceived. And just because they're in India, they're not going to change their core values. And I think what that has done is it's created this kind of groundswell of social media activity around the brand. They're not marketing very much at all in terms of above-the-line activities. Everything is happening within social media. And people are proving to themselves, to their neighbors, their friends, hence the brand, that they're Harley-Davidson worthy. So it's a real model of success where a brand can come in and say, it works 99% of the world, it should work in India for the right number of people. And believe me, it is making an impression loudly in Bombay that Harley-Davidson is in town. But my thought is that for the folks that Harley-Davidson works for, it's a complete lifestyle. And it's something that the brand wraps its arms around consumers, and consumers do the likewise. I mean, they are engaged like never before in social media to protect and to really kind of foster the brand that they believe in. They belong to a brand, and I think consumers belong to a brand, and the brand belongs to them. And I think it really is a two-way relationship, and that's just one example of Harley-Davidson and the culture that it's built with people, not independent of people, but it's with people. In a socially driven digital world, you can't just exist. Brands just can't continue to keep pushing messages out to people. We talked about it in our conversation just a second ago, that even websites are now seen as something that's just pushing information. There's really not an opportunity to engage a consumer online through a website. I think there needs to be this response mode that quite frankly, social media can only provide. I think, and you take a look at some of the more interesting platforms and tools that we use are actually now becoming far more social. With email, you've got Google Buzz, Integra for photos and photo sharing. Something that I've just kind of been turned down to 4 or 5 months ago was iTunes Ping, and the fact that you can be sharing and modulating your music purchases through your friends and kind of sharing music in a way that's a bit more meaningful. You've got Facebook Chat, you've got Rockmelt in terms of an internet browser, and one of the most interesting things that I've seen just recently is Google +1. And I've left that for last. I know that's still in test form, but I think that will philosophically kind of change the way we search. It'll be far more conducive to a social network scene, and we'll be sharing information amongst our friends and our associates in a much more meaningful way. So I think that even the platforms that we're used to using are changing because they're seeing that there is still this one-way communication and not enough of the return that these brands can then use. The interesting part about the Facebook conversation, the presentation this morning, was to see how engaged that brand is with all of us. And obviously they're using all of our information and data and the way that we use it to make it better for us. And I think these are some of the examples of how we're moving in the right direction. Brands want to belong not because it's easier or to advertise or to create a following, but because it really helps people define who they are and what's important to them. And so a purchase pattern that's done through social media is far more effective and potentially long-term because it's built on a relationship and it's built on a belief as opposed to it just being something that we were told to do or we're told that is going to be something that fits into our life. We all want to be something that's or belong to something that's a little bit bigger than us. And I had cooler than us in here, and my wife made me take that out. But I think that we really do want to belong to something that's bigger than us as individuals, and that we want to belong to something or wear a pair of jeans perhaps that makes a real statement about us. And I think that's I look over and over again, and if anyone wants to see after this presentation, I've got a case study I've put together about Diesel specifically and where they're going with the Be Stupid campaign, and that's just now getting to India. I think they've had to tone it down just a bit to kind of to fit within the confines of the Hindu ethic. But I still think that this is a global brand that's doing an amazing thing online, and specifically within the social media space. And I think it creates an environment where people that maybe didn't feel so comfortable about the brand before are now engaged and at least intrigued about what's happening and what that could say about them. How do brands really belong? They start from within. And I think that the whole Harley-Davidson case study real quickly was an example of that. They really have to start with what that brand what's meaningful to that brand and what it feels are its core values. And it then needs to then express those to others, and then others can feed back into that brand, and we can have that conversation. We have a true meaningful conversation based upon a brand speaking with its consumers. Probably not face-to-face like it was done old school. It really is something that we are crowdsourcing and sharing our information readily with brands and vice versa. Just a case in point, this is something that I worked on actually a number of years ago, but it's actually a really cool example because they've leveraged it today, and that's Nike skateboarding. I was fortunate to be part of Goodby Silverstein and Partners when we helped launch Nike skateboarding. And as you can imagine, the skate culture is very anti-corporate, and Nike was seen as a very corporate brand. But Nike was able to kind of involve itself with the sport of skate, not by sponsorship, not by paying anyone, but simply by rolling up their sleeves and kind of getting an understanding of what was in the hearts and the minds of those skateboarders, their true consumers. And when I was at Goodby, it was myself and my creative director, who happened to be one of the original Dogtown boys. He was hardcore skater himself, but a little too old to actually get out and grind it still. He and I spent a lot of time with skaters in San Francisco, and I think we came up with this idea that skaters really are athletes. And what if we treated every athlete like we do skateboarders, and that would be chasing them down the street or calling the police on them or throwing stuff at them, yelling at them. I think we created this aura of an athlete around skateboarders. And I think it was something that initially Nike and Phil Knight were afraid to even think about running on television or in print. God bless him, Rich Silverstein ran it on his own in a couple of places, and it really caught on with the Boys and Girls Clubs. Not in the way that I think Nike was fearful of, but they began to get flooded with letters from parents, school teachers, administrators, and city people saying that I can't believe you're actually looking at skaters as athletes. I think it's remarkable. You've given my son something to grind for. So it was something that it really kind of turned Nike on its head from being this corporate entity that irreverent skaters could not, would not, and did not belong to, but suddenly became the brand of choice. And I think Nike since then has done a very good job of staying true to that mindset of always understanding what their core audience is about. And it's not the alpha male that's guiding those decisions, but it's more about the common kid that's out skating on a regular basis. So I think they've done some remarkable things both offline and online that has kind of changed the way an incredibly cynical group of people think about a brand as big as Nike. For a brand really to kind of create a following, it needs to also talk about or think about its self-presentation. I think just like we all do as we're about to go on a first date or we go into an interview for the first time. I think we think about the things we're going to be asked. I think we think about how we can leverage our history or our job experience into this new opportunity. But we also make sure we have on the best suit or the best shoes or carrying the best bag that we can afford, because how that makes us feel, but also how it presents ourselves to others. So self-preservation or presentation really is about the way we behave in social situations. And when it comes to branding, it's really about how brands approach self-presentation is to help build that sense of belonging. And I've got just a couple of quick examples of how that works, and works very well. There's really two steps to helping build that self-presentation. One is having that distinct culture, and I think there are brands out there that either have it right now. Harley-Davidson, Nike, Adidas, but there are also brands that are working on developing a distinct culture. I think it's even more important to do that today, because defining your brand values through self-presentation attracts a following and a sense of belonging within the digital space. A really cool example of that is Red Bull. I think there's like 4 things that they're doing really, really well, and I'm using these as examples of ways to succeed in terms of creating an aura of self-presentation that will allow people to really kind of look at you in a different way. So just like in the real world, it's all about how you go about showing people who you really are, and it's trying to show the best side of you. And I think attribute number 1 really is about talk about the good stuff. And I think when you're in your interview or you're on that first date, you're not talking about the bad stuff. You're really focusing on what you do well and why you do it well. So I think that first and foremost, it should be describing the most favorable bits about you. Secondly, it's this talk about the cool stuff in a cool way, or talk about the good stuff, I should say, in a cool way. I think it becomes about presentation as well, and it's how you say it and where you say it. And I think don't just talk about it, but if you have the opportunity, show them. And I think what Red Bull is doing in a very cool way too is it's going about this in a non-verbal way. It's showing unique videos, it's creating YouTube channels and relevant content that's there, that's talking about what they do, how they do it, and they're actually showing you how they do it, and it's asking you what your feedback is. And obviously that lends credibility. It creates this openness that I think consumers feel is very, very important. And I think the bottom line is, again, on that date or in that interview, you have to demonstrate that you've got cool friends. And I think you really need to talk about who your associations are. And I think with Red Bull, it's not so much just the athletes that they have, but it's the associations, it's the sports, it's the events, the sponsorships. It's the cool things they're doing. They're also showing you all those cool things, but then they're talking about it and they're backing it up with actually showing you and allowing you to participate in some of those cool activities as well. The final thing is really about consistent voice, and that really is one of the most important aspects of it, because it's not something that you can change from day to day. So in addition to being distinct, I think you really take that distinctiveness needs to be expressed consistently in order to be legitimate, real, and believable, and someone wants to hang out with. I think you need to be really, really consistent. And what can brands do to legitimize their self-presentation in the digital space? What does it take to be legit? I think, to the point earlier, this is a 10 suggestions of a 12-step process, I guess. But I think there are, as Moses would say, there's 10 ways to get to heaven, and I think that I will just go through these very, very quickly with a couple of cool examples. We can talk about them afterwards if you'd like. But I think first and foremost, I think in the digital space, you need to be collaborative. I think you need to be asking consumers how they feel, what they want, and actually utilize that in a meaningful way. And I think Nike did this in a very interesting way during the Tour de France, the chalkbot. I'm hoping that most of you have seen this or read about it. It actually started years and years ago with a young boy living in New York City who was a bit mentally challenged and wasn't able to actually communicate very well through speech. But he was a pretty bright young man, and he took his father's dot matrix printer and some spray cans, and he mounted them on the back of his bicycle, and he rode around the block, specifically the block that his girlfriend lived on, and wrote, "I love you," up and down the sidewalks and up and down the streets. And it became kind of a local phenomenon. Unfortunately, it took a while, but someone at White and Kennedy saw this as an opportunity to take a truly unique idea and really express themselves on a race course. And this was a way that Nike could support Lance Armstrong and his eternal fight against cancer. But people who felt strongly enough about it could submit something online, a thought online, and that thought would then be translated to a printer that was being dragged along the Tour de France race course. And so the entire way, there were messages from fans and loved ones of people who are fighting cancer to support Lance Armstrong. And I think it was one of the more meaningful campaigns that's been done, I think, in recent times, just because of what it did to support a cause, but in the creative way that it was actually